Hello! So, in the last 3 videos I have been talking about initiation rituals and how both the myth of the burning of the goddess in Völuspá and the myth of the hanging of the god in Hávamál probably reflect real-life rituals. We know that mock hangings took place during the Viking Age and that these may very well have been parts of a ritual of initiation that follows the path staked out by Idunn, as is described in detail in the Hávamál poem. The hanging, the fasting and the stabbing leads to Idunn travelling down to the roots of the world tree, in which he finds the runes of fate and receives the drink of poetry, knowledge and transformation, as well as the embrace of the Lady of the Dead, before he returns to life with new knowledge and a new status, that of a binding force, a god, and of a wise sage to whom people come to ask for guidance. There are still aspects of the Idunn's initiation story that should be discussed, but I am still concerned with the ritual aspect of the myth, and I will stick to that. You see, there is an ongoing debate among scholars as to whether the myths of the Poetic Edda may be understood as real sources to pre-Christian religion, or whether the myths should be understood only as sources to the minds of the people who wrote them down during the early Christianized 12th and 13th centuries AD. Now, one thing seems pretty clear to everybody. In Scandinavia, pagan elements and folklore survived very strongly up until the witch trials of the 15th and 16th centuries, when most of these elements were finally and brutally destroyed. Perhaps I shall talk about that another time. The thing is, how good were people's memories really? Are these pagan elements that survived just faint echoes that may have been disfigured by the new Christian mentalities? Or are they part of a truly pagan heritage that has survived? This is impossible to know, but more importantly to us, are the poems of the Edda, the Poetic Edda, true renderings of pagan poetry and pagan myths, or are they inventions of the 12th century Christian poets who just let themselves be inspired by whatever had survived of the poetic language of the past? I believe firmly that the Poetic Edda is a true pagan heritage. I believe that because I am convinced that the myths describe credible pagan rituals, such as that of Idunn's hanging. Supporters of the Christian medieval line have claimed that the hanging is just a version of the crucifixion story and has no roots in pagan thought at all. However, as I have been pointing out lately, Idunn's hanging is a good description of what archaeology has proved happened to victims of sacrifice for more than 1,000 years, beginning in the Iron Ages and before even the birth of Christ. So many written sources about the Viking Age at least describe such hangings, both real hangings and mock hangings, that happened in honor of Idunn. His receiving mead from a woman in the underworld has its ancient archaeological counterparts, as do the sacred marriage in the underworld theme. These 3, the hanging, the ritual serving of mead, and the underworld marriage, are all mythical elements that are dating back at least 2,000 years and often even older. Now, the whole structure of the myth reflects a typical, well-known and almost universal pattern of initiation ritual in pagan societies. 1. The hanging is a typical archaic technique of ecstasy as described by Mircea Eliade in his famous book on shamanism. A technique of ecstasy is designed to cause the subject to alter his or her consciousness so that they may travel out of their bodies and into other worlds. These kinds of techniques are known from shamanistic, ascetic and other pagan traditions. We may also call it a vision quest, since the goal is to open one's vision. Idunn indeed has a vision as he peers down and discovers the runes. I personally can see no Christian element whatsoever in this vision quest story. 2. The next step of the ritual pattern is the vision itself. Idunn sees the runes, secrets that have been hidden since the birth of the universe, secrets held by the ladies of the Well of Origin. We know that the runes and the fates and the world's tree belong to an age-old pagan tradition. That is, there is no Christian medieval element to his vision. 3. The third step of the pattern is the descent, when Odin travels into the underworld. Again, is this a pagan or a Christian medieval element? This is definitely pagan. 4. The fourth step of the pattern is the trials. Odin has to prove his worth and his courage, and through his training, having received the powerful magical spell songs from his maternal uncle, he manages to convince the guardian of the underworld realm to let him live and marry his daughter. Christian or pagan element? 5. The fifth step of the pattern, the path of initiation, is the consecration. This is where Odin is rewarded for his trials, receives the knowledge of the runes and the love of the goddess, symbolized as the serving of a mead that lets the knowledge of the runes enter his very soul, and in the marriage with the lady of the dead. Here I can see similarities to proven and long-standing 5,000-year-old rituals of sacred marriage in Sumer, and I can see similarities with the 5,000-year-old texts that speak of Soma, the drink of immortality, in the Vedas, but I can see no Christian medieval element whatsoever. 6. The sixth step is the return and the result. Odin returned to life and has become, as he says, a sage, a magician, and a god. Again, a pagan and very ancient element. So my point here is that from beginning to end, and in every detail and with every purpose, the story of Odin's hanging is completely pagan in origin, and there is no way that it could have been invented within a Christian framework. This in itself is one of the many pieces of evidence that the Poetic Edda is a source to pagan lore. The pattern I just described is typical of pagan initiation rituals, and it includes detailed descriptions of the real-life ritual practices that are proven to have existed during the pagan eras. And the story of Odin is not the only one in the Poetic Edda. There are, in fact, so many that I have to pick out a few and stick to only the two first steps of the initiation in this video. Step 1, the vision quest with its technique of ecstasy, and step 2, the subsequent vision. The vision always leads to the other steps, the descent, the trial, the consecration, and the return, but I shall now focus on only the first two steps. The Poetic Edda provides us with several different kinds of ritual descriptions. Obviously not everybody had to hang. Sometimes it would be enough to sacrifice someone, something else. In the Hyndluljóð, the song of the she-wolf, the human being called Ottar makes sacrifice to the Disir, the female forces. According to the poem, Ottar had always been devoted to the Disir, but the sacrifice is special this time because he has decided that he wants to claim his heritage, which is the gold of Valland. Now, Valland is another name for Valhalla, the afterlife of the chosen dead. Gold is a metaphor for wisdom and divine light. So what Ottar is praying for is the wisdom of the afterlife, and we are told that this wisdom will lead to Valhalla, a chosen death. As Ottar sacrifices and blood covers the altar, the rock of the altar turns into crystal, and the goddess Freya appears, makes Ottar into a boar and rides him down to hell. And there we go. The sacrifice is the technique of ecstasy by which Ottar receives his vision, this time the transformation of his sacrifice, the appearance of the great goddess, and his own identification with the sacrifice as he becomes the sacrificial animal and moves into the underworld. The structure of the whole myth is exactly as that of Odin. Sacrifice followed by a vision, followed by a descent into the underworld, followed by trials and teachings below, followed by the goddess offering him the so-called drink of memory and calling him her husband. The goal is to reach Valhalla, an alternative afterlife. So this one element has led someone to believe that there is a salvation theme in the story, and that it must thus be a Christian element in the story. However, who says that pagans did not think about salvation? The mystery cults that were everywhere in the pagan Hellenistic and Roman empires were all concerned with the salvation of the soul after death. Salvation that could only come if you in life had gone through the initiations into the mysteries of the goddess. Again, I must say, I can see nothing Christian about this myth at all. It is pagan through and through, even with its pagan and older, I should say, version of salvation. So, we have the several heroic poems that follow the same structure of initiation, all offering new alternatives and details as to how one seeks the necessary vision. The stories of King Hjörvard and of Sigurd both describe how heroes seek visions in sacred groves and such like. In the poem of Helgi Hjörvardsson, we learn that Earl Atli, on behalf of his king, goes into the so-called Svavaland, the land of sleep, in which he stays for a while, trying to convince the king, Svafnir, which means the sleep-maker, to give his daughter as a wife to the king. When this fails, the Earl Atli returns to the land of the waking and goes into a grove in which he dozes off again, and then, miraculously, he understands the speech of birds. And the little bird speaks to him. The bird makes demands for sacrifice. Atli sacrifices, and then the bird gives him a vision of the beautiful maiden of the underworld and explains that she is guarded by a giant in eagle's disguise. Now this eagle is familiar. It is the eagle Ræsvelger, corpse swallower, death itself, that keeps the bright, shining golden maiden in darkness. The bird explains that the eagle needs to be killed before he can take the maiden. Now, during the third part of the story, the king and the earl together ascend a sacred mountain from which they can both look into the land of sleep. There they see the eagle and realize that the eagle of death is guarding a maiden for both of them, one for the king and one for the earl. Finally, the two of them go to sleep, again by the river that is the border to the land of sleep, and while the king sleeps away, the earl goes into the land of sleep, kills the giant eagle of death, and returns with both the golden bright maidens. Okay, so what appears like a fairy tale may be broken down into the elements of the structure of initiation that I talked about earlier, and each element actually describes what would happen during a ritual. 1. When one bothers to translate the names of the places, it makes sense that Atli and the king always fall to sleep before they travel to the land of the maidens, which is in fact the land of sleep. This element is about dreams. Everything in this story happens in the realm of dreams, which was obviously deeply connected to reality, again a pagan element. The goal of dreaming, the maiden is a magical maiden. This bride, she lives in dreams. Now, Atli's title, the Earl, as a Jarl in Old Norse, is not a coincidence. The title Earl is derived from Old Norse title Erilar, which actually refers to a magician, a sage, a priest, or shaman, which is why the Earl does all the dreaming and traveling into the dream realms. He is a shaman type. So although the bride is intended for the king's shaman does most of the work, and the king is only required to spend a night at the borders of the dream realm together with his shaman. Another part of the ritual here is seeking the advice of birds within a sacred grove. This is not an element of fantasy and fairy tale. It is a detailed description of an age-old religious tradition. 2000 years ago, Roman sources explained that the Germanic tribes all worshipped their gods within sacred groves, in which they would also talk to birds and other animals. The action, meditating within a sacred grove, followed by the building of an altar and the sacrifice of cattle within the same grove, all with the purpose of having visions of the supernatural maiden of the land of dreams. Well, to me it seems obvious that these are all descriptions of pagan practices. All these activities lead to a journey into the underworld, in which the bright maidens are rescued from the guardianship of the eagle of death and brought back to the waking world as brides of those who have undertaken the initiation journey. So, okay, for the sake of space, I have to finish here, but just so many stories that I am going to upload another video very soon, just after this one, continuing the same theme. So if you want to know more of pagan initiation rituals as described in the Edda, look to video number 15. So, Goodbye for now.